During the editing of this video, I realized that at one point I sound like I am okay with kids returning to school during the pandemic. That is far from the case. If you have even the barest doubt, as I do, then one parent to another, my advice is don't send them to school. It is not worth the risk. There's an old saying, may you live in interesting times. I, for one, would like things to be boring for a while. The interesting times we live in are potentially fatal right now, and Prager U isn't helping. Welcome to the Nexus. Today is going to be a sobering reminder that we are still dealing with a pandemic. COVID is insidious. It attacks and damages lung tissue, is very difficult for the body to fight, has a long incubation period, is easily spread, and after it's done its damage, your depleted immune system could have to deal with a follow-up bacterial lung infection. And on top of all of that, you're still looking at scar tissue in your lungs that will compromise your breathing from then on. Yet what are we hearing? People saying that masks are killing people because they can't breathe. If you can't breathe, slow down your activity level and find a place away from people to get some air. That elected officials and doctors are mandating the devil's laws, and that we want to throw God's wonderful breathing system out the door. These procedures are being enforced for a reason, because God's wonderful breathing system doesn't work all that great if you get infected. And at the same time, we also have assholes like this guy refusing store policy to wear a mask and acting like he's being threatened with a weapon. And this is happening all over the country. Masks suck. It can be hard to breathe, or you can feel a little claustrophobic from them, but if you can, you need to wear them as much as possible. Your lungs will thank you. The vast majority of this kind of talk is coming from our embarrassment of a President Trump, who set an example early on by refusing to wear a mask from the very beginning, and only recently has bothered to put one on. He has consistently ignored advice and warnings from doctors, the CDC, and the World Health Organization, while threatening to pull funding or pulling funding from them, and is now doing the same thing to schools. He is also putting the responsibility of tracking COVID cases on a firm that he decided on, and removing the CDC's ability to monitor the spread. If that isn't a red flag, I don't know what is. We will no longer be able to get accurate numbers on cases without the CDC involved in tracking them, and everyone that recognizes that issue knows it. Which brings me to what I wanted to talk about with Prager U. Their YouTube account reaches more than 2.5 million people. When you can reach that many people, you have a duty to present factually accurate information, at least as accurate as you can be. Too much to ask, apparently, from Will Witt and Dr. Jeff Barkey, who had a sit down to talk about the spike in COVID cases. They gloss over this whole thing to make it seem like it isn't a big deal, which is very concerning. I'm just a random voice in the void, but a voice nonetheless, and I will draw as much attention to this as I can. Now, they touched on several points, including the economy, medical capacity, masks, hydroxychloroquine, and the main point that I want to cover, the return to school. The efficacy of hydroxychloroquine is a crapshoot, as far as I can tell. There is no real indication it is effective in any real way. The economy is a political move as far as I'm concerned, because King Mouth Breather needs it to do well to help pave the way to a second term. While I understand that we couldn't stay on lockdown forever, with unrestricted reopenings, the road to his re-election is going to be paved and paid for with American bodies and lives. Here, though, we're going to focus on masks, school, and medical capacity.
In terms of the masks actually helping stop the virus, what are your thoughts on that?
You know, I don't want to get too controversial. The mask issue has really been beat up. My personal opinion is masks have very little utility in preventing the spread of the virus. For starters, most people have no idea how to wear a mask. So if you just watch people with their masks on, notoriously, they're every 30 seconds, they're touching it, they're adjusting it, they're scratching their nose. And as soon as you do that, you render the mask basically useless.
Masks may not be perfect, and the high-end ones are virtually inaccessible to you if you are not in the medical field. If you wear it right, though, it can substantially increase your protection from the virus, both from transmitting it, which is the main purpose of the mask, to contain your inadvertent spreading, and as a barrier to afford you some protection along with keeping that distance, that social distance. Saying they have little utility will make people think they should not wear them, which is irresponsible and potentially life-threatening coming from a doctor who should just burn his degree at this point. Wear masks, keep your distance, and by doing so, you will be proactive in protecting yourself and not reactive when you get sick. You will, by extension, protect your family from exposure as well. Now, if you aren't a parent, you may not have realized that the lockdown orders came out shortly before the end of last school year. Kids have been on an extended summer vacation, and the hope was that by doing so, it would flatten the curve and reduce the overall strain on the hospitals in the short term to make sure that people could be treated long term without hospitals being overrun due to limits on medical supplies. And it started to work. But then people started thinking it was over and safe again. We don't do well as a species dealing with threats we can't see or have little to no exposure to. We also don't grasp the weight of extremely large numbers conceptually. That is a learned behavior. So we started to ignore guidelines like distancing and masks, and we saw an uptick in cases. The president had a national day of prayer, another spike from people expecting God to protect them instead of the mask, and 6 feet of breathing room. Now things have opened back up, and Trump is holding rallies and causing protests, and there are some riots over his mishandling of everything that he touches. Many people aren't wearing masks or distancing. So guess what? There's another spike. The wheels have just about come off here, and we are still in the first wave. Compared to other countries, we have failed to contain this virus, and I do mean failed. Moving forward into the next school year, you should be able to see the problem. I don't know about you, but when I was in school, social distancing would have been non-existent, and it is the same way today. You are not going to get young kids to wear masks all day. That isn't happening, especially not with people like we have in Florida spouting their nonsense and not making their kids wear masks. If a bunch of kids in the class don't have to wear masks, then the others won't either, which brings us to the dangerous misinformation that Prager U is putting out there.
The young and the healthy are relatively immune to this virus. They do well when they catch it, they recover quickly, and they don't die from this virus. In children, they're so immune that they have a greater risk of influenza than they ever did from COVID-19, which is why, by the way, I'm advocating open up the schools with almost no restrictions. We got to get the children back in the classrooms because it's been zero. Across the country, the number of deaths in children have been very, very small. I think it's maybe 30 or 40 now. So it's clear that children aren't at risk. What they are at risk from is delaying their education, from delaying their socialization, from keeping them home and therefore keeping parents who work home as well. That's a greater risk.
I don't know where Barkey got his degree, but whoever issued it needs to revoke it. Kids are definitely at risk. If you're a parent, you know that they catch every little cold and cough that comes through the class from just one kid. The classroom is a petri dish of disease, and everyone knows it. Just like with the flu, the young and the elderly are at the highest risk of this virus, and this virus does considerably more damage than the flu ever dreamed of being able to do. As for children not being at risk, we know that isn't true. Hell, 1/3 of Florida kids are testing positive right now for COVID. And we know it does serious damage to lung tissue, even if it's a mild case. Even in the beginning of this whole thing, we had young and healthy kids being killed by this virus. Kids are at risk, and they are casualties of the rampant stupidity and mistrust of science that Trump is encouraging by not listening to sound advice. If schools open up unrestricted, we will see a spike in cases again, and it will be the kids that pay the price for it. If you can homeschool kids, do it. If your school district offers some form of distance or virtual learning programs, take them. If they don't, or that isn't an option for you, then you need to pull the ripcord hard with your kids and make sure they know exactly how dangerous this is and that they need to wear masks, wash their hands, and do everything they can to stay as distant as they can from others. Constantly monitor them for fevers and early symptoms and get them treated as soon as possible. It's better to plan for the worst right now rather than assume it's just a regular cold. Now that brings us to medical capacity. There was no real expectation that we would get this virus handled before the school year began. That simply wasn't going to happen. Not here in the US. Smaller countries, they would be able to pull it off. And New Zealand actually has. New Zealand is mostly clear and actually had the first concert since this whole thing kicked off. The plan was to stretch the overall hospitalizations over as long a period as possible to keep the system from being overwhelmed, so that people wouldn't be in a position where they would not be treated. Problem is, we haven't done near enough to stretch that out. If schools open back up, like Barkey is advocating for, and if we all go back to business as usual right now, then we will be right back where we were at the beginning of this whole ordeal, and it will be worse. We won't be worrying about hospitals getting overrun. They will be overrun, and fast. We aren't dealing with a handful of cases now. Now we are dealing with more than 100,000. It will spike, and spike hard. Keep your family safe. Protect yourselves from this virus as best you can, and hopefully we can make it through this whole thing intact.